The first thing I noticed was the silence. Not the good kind either. Not that peaceful early morning silence you get out in the woods when the fog is still hanging low and the birds haven't fully woken up yet. This silence felt wrong, empty somehow, like the land itself was holding its breath. Then I saw the stumps. Fresh cuts, pale wood still wet with sap. And right there, standing in the middle of my property line like he owned the place, was a yellow logging machine bigger than my first house. That was the moment I realized somebody had just made the most expensive mistake of their life. I own about 78 acres outside a little town called Belridge, Tennessee. Not ranch land, not farmland, timber, mixed hardwood mostly. Red oak, cedar, hickory, a few old walnut trees that my grandfather used to brag about like they were members of the family. He planted some of those walnuts himself back in the late 60s, which sounds crazy now because nobody plants walnut trees expecting to enjoy them personally. You plant those for your kids, maybe your grandkids if life works out right. My granddad used to say trees teach patience better than church ever could. At the time, I thought that sounded like old man nonsense. Turns out he was right about most things. The property had been in my family 3 generations. When my dad passed, everybody assumed I'd sell it off. Truth is, financially, it probably would have made sense. I worked construction for almost 20 years before my knees started giving me problems, and there were definitely months where the taxes on that land hit harder than I wanted to admit. But every time I thought about selling it, I'd walk those woods for an hour and change my mind. There's something about land your family bled on that gets into your bones. About a month before everything happened, a logging company moved onto the neighboring parcel north of mine. Company called Ridgeline Timber Services. Big operation. Expensive equipment. Crews everywhere. You could hear chainsaws and diesel engines from sunrise till dark. Honestly, I didn't think much of it at first. Timber gets cut around here all the time. It's part of life in eastern Tennessee. Still, there was something about those guys I didn't like. Maybe it was the way they drove too fast down the county roads, spraying gravel everywhere. Or maybe it was because every conversation with them somehow felt like they were already irritated before you even opened your mouth. A lot of those outfits roll into small towns acting like locals are obstacles instead of people. The first time I met their foreman was at Miller's gas station off Route 18. Big guy named Travis Boone. Thick neck, mirrored sunglasses, dipped and shoved into the sleeve of his flannel. He nearly clipped my truck backing up his trailer and acted annoyed at me for existing. He looked at my muddy boots and said, "You one of the landowners around here?" I said, "Depends who's asking." That got a laugh out of the cashier, but Travis didn't smile. He just spat into a bottle and nodded toward the hills. "We're clearing Northridge this month. Gonna be loud." I remember saying, "Long as you stay on your side of the markers, I don't care if you launch rockets up there." He smirked at that. Not friendly either. More like the kind of smile somebody gives when they already think the rules don't apply to them. A week later, I noticed one of my orange boundary stakes had been knocked over. Now, that by itself doesn't sound like much, but landowners notice stuff like that, especially people who grew up working property lines. I hammered the stake back in, checked the steel survey pin underneath, and figured maybe a machine brushed against it accidentally. Then another marker disappeared. Then another. That's when the little voice in my head started whispering. I called the county survey office just to double-check my maps. Everything matched exactly. My grandfather paid for a full legal survey back in 1984 after some dispute with a neighboring cattle farmer, so our property lines were unusually clear. Steel pins every few hundred feet. Bright paint markings on key trees. No confusion unless somebody wanted there to be confusion. And that's what bothered me. Because confusion is messy. This felt deliberate. A couple days later, my neighbor Earl Jensen stopped by while I was splitting firewood behind the barn. Earl's retired Army, pushes 70, still walks around like he's inspecting troops. He leaned against the fence and said, "You been up north end lately?" I shook my head. "Not this week." He scratched his beard. "Might wanna." That was all he said. Earl's one of those men who never wastes words unless they matter. So the next morning I grabbed my thermos and headed up the ridge just after sunrise. Cold morning too. Frost still crunching under my boots. As soon as I got halfway up the trail, I smelled fresh-cut wood. Sharp smell. Sweet almost. Then I noticed sunlight coming through places sunlight shouldn't have been coming through. That stopped me cold. See, when you spend enough years walking the same stretch of woods, your brain memorizes it without you realizing. You know where shadows fall, which trees lean slightly east, Which rocks stay damp after rain. So when something changes, you feel it before you understand it. And my woods felt wounded. I kept walking faster. That's when I found the first stump. Fresh. Smooth cut. Couldn't have been more than a day old. Then another. Then 5 more. I remember just standing there blinking at them because my brain refused to catch up. It honestly felt like walking into your house and finding somebody stole half the walls. The further I walked, the worse it got. Entire sections gone. Massive red oaks that had probably stood there before I was born, erased. Cedars flattened into muddy tracks. Branches scattered everywhere like bones after a storm. And then I reached the walnut line. That's the part one still get angry thinking about. Those walnuts sat along the north slope near the creek bed. Straight trunks. Mature growth. Absolutely beautiful trees. My grandfather used to walk me down there when I was a kid and tell me, "These trees will still be standing when you're old and mean." Instead, all I saw were stumps. 7 of them. Cut low and clean. I actually laughed when I saw it. Not because it was funny, more because I couldn't believe somebody could be that stupid. I crouched beside one stump and put my hand on it. Still warm from the saw. That's when I heard engines nearby. I looked uphill through the trees and saw one of Ridgeline's skidders dragging logs toward their loading area, my logs. And the craziest part? They weren't even trying to hide it. I stood there for a good 10 seconds, just staring at that skidder moving uphill with one of my walnut trunks chained behind it like some kind of trophy. The driver looked right at me too. Not surprised. Not nervous. Just glanced over. Then kept going like hauling timber off somebody else's property was as normal as picking up groceries. That's when the anger finally hit. Not explosive anger either. Worse. The cold kind. The kind where everything suddenly becomes very clear. I started walking toward their staging area, stepping over shredded branches and tire ruts deep enough to snap an ankle. The deeper I got into that cut line, the uglier it looked. They hadn't just clipped a few trees by accident. They bulldozed straight through the property boundary for nearly 200 yards. There were crushed saplings everywhere, torn up creek banks, diesel leaking into mud puddles. It looked less like logging and more like a military operation rolled through the woods. And all I could think was, they knew. Nobody crosses that much-marked boundary by accident. When I reached the clearing, half a dozen workers were loading logs onto a truck. One younger guy noticed me first. He looked maybe 22, 23. Hard hat too big for his head. He quietly muttered, Travis. The foreman turned around from near the trailer office holding a clipboard and coffee cup. Same mirrored sunglasses. Same permanent expression like the world owed him something. He saw me coming and sighed before I even spoke. That pissed me off more than anything. Like I was inconveniencing him. I stopped about 10 feet away and said, "You boys cut onto my property." He shrugged. Boundary lines disputed. I actually laughed at that. No, it ain't. He took a slow sip of coffee and said, "According to who?" "According to the damn county survey." One of the workers looked down immediately. Another guy suddenly got real interested in tightening chains on the trailer. You could tell right away this conversation had happened before. Travis tilted his head slightly. "Look, old man, trees don't exactly come with addresses." Old man. I was 48 at the time. I said, "Those orange stakes every 50 yards weren't enough of a clue?" He smirked. "Machines knock stuff over." Then he pointed behind me toward the cut line and added, "Besides, owner of the north parcel said the edge was fuzzy." That right there told me everything. Somebody fed them an excuse they wanted to hear. Now, the guy who owned the neighboring parcel was named Dale Mercer. Dale had inherited around 400 acres after his uncle died and immediately started liquidating pieces of it because he was drowning in gambling debt. Everybody in Belridge knew it. Dale was the kind of man who borrowed money with one hand while scratching lottery tickets with the other. About 3 years earlier, Dale tried buying 15 acres off me near the creek because he wanted easier road access for future timber sales. I turned him down politely, then less politely after he kept pushing. After that, things got weird. Fence sections mysteriously cut, ATVs crossing onto my trails. Little stuff designed to annoy more than damage. At one point, Dale actually told me at Miller's barbecue, "You're sitting on land you can't even afford to use." I told him, "Funny thing about ownership. I don't need your permission to keep it." He never forgot that. Standing there looking at Travis Boone, hearing him suddenly call my property line fuzzy, I knew exactly where this started. I looked around the clearing and said, "You got a copy of the survey Dale gave you?" Travis shrugged again. Not my department. Then whose department is it? Lawyers, probably. The way he said lawyers told me he thought that word alone ended conversations around here. Maybe for some people. Not for me. I stepped closer and pointed toward the trucks. Every log that came off my land gets documented starting right now. Travis lowered his coffee cup slowly. You threatening us? No, I said calmly. I'm promising paperwork. That got a couple chuckles from the crew. One guy actually whispered, "Oh, paperwork. Real funny." I looked directly at Travis and said, "You better hope your insurance is good." Then I turned around and walked away. And honestly, that bothered him more than yelling would have. Because angry people are predictable. Calm people scare the hell out of folks who know they screwed up. The second I got home, I called my cousin Nate. Nate runs a small surveying company outside Knoxville and probably knows more about timber law than half the attorneys in Tennessee. He answered with, "If this is about your truck again, I already told you transmission fluid ain't optional." I said, "How much trouble does a logging company get in for knowingly crossing a property line?" Silence. Then he said, "How bad?" I told him 7 mature walnut trees minimum plus hardwoods. Another silence. Then, Jesus Christ. By noon the next day, Nate was out there with professional GPS equipment, property maps, old county records, and enough measuring tools to launch a satellite. We spent 6 straight hours documenting everything. Every stump got photographed. Every cut measured. Every missing tree cataloged. Nate even used drone footage to overlay the logging path directly against legal property boundaries. There wasn't an inch of gray area. At one point, Nate just shook his head and said, "Buddy, they didn't drift over the line. They invaded Poland." That was the first time I laughed all day. But underneath it, I felt sick. Because once we started adding up numbers, reality hit hard. See, most people hear tree and picture firewood. Mature timber isn't firewood, especially walnut. Black walnut is premium wood. Furniture makers love it. Cabinet shops love it. Veneer companies pay insane money for straight mature trunks. One healthy walnut tree can be worth more than a decent used truck depending on size and quality. And these idiots cut 7. Plus red oak. Plus cedar. Plus secondary growth damage from machinery. Plus soil restoration. Plus creek runoff mitigation. The total kept climbing. 10,000. 20. 30. By evening we crossed 60 grand before penalties. I leaned back in my kitchen chair staring at the numbers while Nate drank coffee from a stained travel mug. Finally I said, "They're never gonna believe this bill." Nate snorted. "Doesn't matter what they believe." Then he looked at me carefully and added, "You know Tennessee timber trespass law ain't gentle, right?" I know enough. Triple damages if they knowingly crossed marked property. I nodded slowly. Triple damages. That number sat heavy in the room. Nate leaned forward. "Question is whether you want to settle quietly or burn these people to the ground." I remember looking out the kitchen window toward the tree line, or what used to be the tree line, and I thought about my grandfather. About all those years he spent maintaining that land by hand, clearing trails himself, protecting creek banks from erosion, walking fence lines every Sunday after church. Those trees took decades to grow. These people destroyed them in less than 2 days. And somehow expected me to shrug it off because they had expensive lawyers and bigger equipment. I looked back at Nate and said, "I want every dollar the law allows." So we built the invoice. And when I say invoice, I don't mean some angry handwritten note. I mean a full professional packet. Property surveys, GPS overlays, timber valuations, species identification, market estimates, restoration costs, equipment damage assessments, time-stamped photographs, drone stills, everything organized cleaner than a bank loan file. Nate actually joked, "This thing looks like the IRS prepared it." Good. That was exactly the energy I wanted. The final total before penalties sat just over $83,000. With triple damages, we were staring at nearly $250,000. I mailed the packet certified and emailed digital copies to Ridgeline Timber Services corporate office in Chattanooga. Then I waited. 2 days later my phone rang while I was repairing fence posts near the barn. Unknown number. I answered and immediately heard laughing. Actual laughing. A man finally said, "This is Greg Hollister from Ridgeline Legal Department. I just read your little invoice." Little invoice. I wiped sweat off my forehead and said, "Great. Then you know where to send payment." That made him laugh harder. "Sir, with respect, You can't seriously expect us to pay $200,000 over a property line misunderstanding. I said, you cut marked timber knowingly. He replied, allegedly. That word right there. Allegedly. Corporate people love words that make theft sound temporary. I leaned against the fence and said, your foreman admitted the crew crossed onto my property. Silence for half a second. Then Greg said carefully, our understanding is the neighboring owner represented the boundary differently. There are steel survey pins in the ground. Still, these situations can become complicated. No, I said. Complicated is divorce. This is math. Another silence. Then his tone hardened a little. Mr. Whitaker, litigation can drag on a very long time. Expensive for everybody involved. There it was. The threat. Not direct enough to quote in court. Just the classic corporate strategy. Drag it out until the smaller guy folds. Problem was, they misread me completely. I spent 20 years working construction sites with men who screamed in your face over concrete pours and steel delays. You learn real quick that intimidation only works when somebody's afraid to lose. And by that point, I was already angry enough not to care. I said, Greg, you know what my favorite part of this whole thing is? He sounded confused. What? You already hauled the evidence onto your own trucks. Then I hung up. 3 days later, things got even more interesting. Because somebody burned one of my boundary stakes overnight. And that's when this stopped being just about timber. The burned stake was still smoking when I found it. Not flames or anything dramatic like that. Just blackened wood stuck crooked in the dirt with melted orange paint dripping down the side. Somebody had poured fuel on it during the night and lit it up thinking they were making a point. And honestly, they were. Because up until then, I still believed this thing might end as nothing more than an expensive legal fight between a stubborn landowner and a reckless logging company. Ugly, sure, but business. The second somebody crossed onto my property after dark and started destroying markers, it became personal. I stood there staring at that burned stake while morning fog rolled through the trees, and all I could think was, you boys are panicking now. People only start covering tracks when they realize how deep the hole really is. I called the sheriff's office immediately. Deputy Lena Torres came out about an hour later. Good deputy. Smart. Grew up 2 counties over and didn't have much patience for rich contractors pretending local laws were optional. She crouched beside the burned marker and sighed. That's not exactly subtle. Nope. You got cameras out here? Not on this trail. She looked toward the neighboring ridge. Any idea who did it? I laughed once. Well, I doubt squirrels suddenly developed a grudge. That got a smile out of her. But then she got serious again and said quietly, off the record, you're making some people nervous. I asked Ridgeline. She hesitated half a second too long. That told me enough. By then word had started spreading around Bell Ridge. Small towns are basically giant group chats with pickup trucks. Folks at the diner were already talking about the logging company that cut the wrong man's timber. Every gas station conversation somehow got quieter when I walked in. And the funny thing was, people kept treating me like I'd suddenly become dangerous. Not because I threatened anybody, because I stayed calm. That unsettles people more than yelling ever will. A few days later, I got another call from Ridgeline's legal department, except this time Greg Hollister wasn't laughing anymore. His voice sounded tired. He said, we'd like to arrange a formal meeting. I replied, you found your checkbook already? No laugh this time. Mr. Whitaker, I think it's in everyone's interest to discuss reasonable settlement options. Reasonable. Corporate language for please stop bleeding us publicly. The meeting got scheduled at a law office in Knoxville the following Tuesday. Nate came with me along with a local attorney named Susan Keller who specialized in land disputes and frankly scared everybody she talked to. Tiny woman. Couldn't have been 5'2", but she had this way of staring at people like she already knew exactly how they'd disappoint her. Before we walked into the conference room, she adjusted her glasses and said, let them talk first. People say stupid things when silence makes them uncomfortable. Turns out she was absolutely right. Inside the room sat Greg Hollister, 2 Ridgeline executives, Travis Boone the foreman, and another attorney I'd never met before wearing cufflinks that probably cost more than my truck tires. Nobody looked happy to see me, especially Travis. The second our eyes met, I could tell something had changed in him. The swagger was mostly gone now. Still sitting tough, still trying to look confident, but there was tension underneath it. Like a man who'd finally realized the bar fight wasn't ending quickly. We all sat down. Coffee got poured. Papers shuffled. That weird fake politeness people used before financial violence started filling the room. Greg cleared his throat first. Mr. Whitaker, after reviewing documentation provided by your surveyor, we acknowledge there may have been unintentional encroachment during harvesting operations. Susan immediately said, "You mean trespass?" The room went quiet. Greg forced a smile. "As I said, encroachment." Susan smiled right back. "And as I said, trespass." I gotta admit, watching expensive lawyers politely threaten each other is kind of entertaining. Greg slid a folder across the table. Ridgeline is prepared to offer a settlement of $90,000 in good faith. 90,000. A week earlier, that number would have sounded life-changing. Now it just annoyed me. Susan didn't even touch the folder. She simply asked, "Is this before or after statutory treble damages?" One of the executives finally spoke up. Gray-haired guy named Martin Keene. "Let's not pretend this case is guaranteed." Susan opened our file calmly. Marked property boundaries. GPS documentation. Drone imaging. Witness statements. Admitted harvesting activity. Burned survey marker after notice of claim. She looked directly at him. "You're right. It's not guaranteed." Then she paused. "It's catastrophic." That word hit the room hard. You could actually feel the energy shift. Travis muttered something under his breath and leaned back in his chair. Susan turned toward him immediately. "Would you like to repeat that for the record, Mr. Boone?" He looked away. "See, guys like Travis survive their whole lives on intimidation. Loud voice. Big equipment. Bigger attitude. They expect regular people to back down the second conflict gets uncomfortable. But courtrooms don't care how wide your shoulders are." And deep down, I think he finally understood that. Greg rubbed his temples and tried another angle. Dragging this through court helps nobody. I finally spoke for the first time in nearly 10 minutes. "You know what helps me?" I said. "Not having 70-year-old walnut trees stolen." Nobody answered that. I leaned forward slowly. "You know the part that really bothers me? It's not even the money anymore." Martin crossed his arms. "Then what is it?" "The assumption." He frowned. "What assumption?" "That because I live in a small town and wear muddy boots, you figured I'd roll over once lawyers got involved." Silence again. And here's the thing people misunderstand about moments like that. I wasn't trying to sound tough. I genuinely meant it. The money mattered, sure. The land mattered more. But what really got under my skin was how casually they dismissed the damage. Like old trees, creek beds, family property. All of it was just collateral beneath their schedule. Like efficiency mattered more than stewardship. My grandfather would have hated that. Greg finally asked carefully, "What exactly are you asking for today?" Susan answered before I could. "Full damages under state timber trespass statute, plus restoration costs." The executive actually scoffed. "That's absurd." Susan replied instantly. "No, Mr. Keene. What's absurd is cutting through clearly marked private property because your crew was behind schedule. That landed hard because nobody denied it. Not one person at that table claimed confusion anymore. The whole boundary dispute story had completely collapsed. Now it was just about money and accountability. About 20 minutes later, the meeting paused so Ridgeline's team could discuss internally, which is corporate language for panic privately. I stepped outside onto the building patio while Nate lit a cigarette nearby. He looked at me and grinned. "You realize they're terrified, right?" I shrugged. "Good." Nate exhaled smoke and laughed softly. "Buddy, they thought they were bullying some rural landowner. Instead, they walked into a forensic accounting project with chainsaws. That one got me." I laughed harder than I had in weeks. Not because any of this was truly funny, but because stress eventually reaches a point where your brain just starts leaking humor to survive. About 15 minutes later, Greg came back outside alone. No tie now. Top collar undone. Different man entirely from the guy who laughed on the phone. He stood beside the railing quietly for a second before saying, "Off the record?" I shrugged. "Depends." He looked out toward the parking lot and said, "Travis pushed the crew too far south, trying to speed up extraction before rain hit. They knew the markers were there." I didn't say anything. Greg continued. "Dale Mercer told them nobody would fight it." There it was. The truth. Not confusion. Not accident. Greed mixed with arrogance. Most disasters are built exactly that way. Greg sighed heavily. Corporates worried about precedent. If this goes public, every landowner near an active harvest starts scrutinizing boundaries. And they should. He nodded once, like he knew I was right, but hated it anyway. Then he asked quietly, "What happens if we pay?" I looked at him for a long moment before answering. "You replant what you destroyed. You stay off my land forever. And maybe next time your crews see a boundary marker, they stop the machine instead of pretending not to." He gave a tired smile. "Fair enough." 2 weeks later, the settlement cleared. Full payment. Not every penny we originally projected under maximum penalties, but enough that Ridgeline definitely felt it. Rumor around Belridge was they had to delay 2 equipment purchases and restructure a harvesting contract after the payout. Could be gossip. Could be true. Either way, nobody crossed my boundary line again. As for Dale Mercer, things didn't end great for him either. Once lawyers started digging through communications, his little fuzzy boundary story unraveled fast. Last I heard, he sold another chunk of land to cover separate lawsuits and eventually moved out west somewhere. Funny how fast pride disappears when invoices start arriving. That spring, I used part of the settlement money to begin restoration work. New saplings, creek stabilization, soil repair. It'll take decades before that section of forest looks the same again, maybe longer. Some damage can be repaired financially, but never fully replaced. That's the part people online always argue about when they hear this story. Some folks say I should have taken the first settlement and moved on. Others think I should have dragged Ridgeline through court publicly and tried destroying the company completely. Truth is, I still don't know what perfect justice would have looked like, because no amount of money replaces 70 years of growth. But I'll tell you this. The first time I walked that restored section at sunset after the new saplings went in, I stopped beside one of the old walnut stumps and just stood there listening to the wind move through the hills. Same land, same creek, same dirt my grandfather walked decades ago. And for the first time since all this started, the woods didn't feel wounded anymore. Just healing. Slowly. Patiently. The way forests always do. But every now and then, especially when I pass those property markers, I still think about how close those guys came to getting away with it. If Earl hadn't warned me, if I waited another week, if those survey lines weren't documented so carefully, most people probably never would have known. And honestly, that's the part that should bother everybody. Because there are a whole lot of powerful people out there who count on regular folks staying quiet when something gets taken from them. Sometimes it's land. Sometimes it's money. Sometimes it's dignity. The details change, but the game stays the same. Anyway, I'm curious what you think. If you were in my position, would you have taken the first offer and walked away, or pushed all the way through court for maximum damages? And do you think companies like Ridgeline deserved a second chance after something like this? Or should one mistake be enough to bury a business for good? Let me know down in the comments, because I've heard arguments both ways and honestly, some of them make pretty good points.